He thought it was just another ordinary night, a quiet drive home after a long day. But the flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror carried more than a routine stop. They carried suspicion, prejudice, and danger. Within moments, a man who had done nothing wrong was treated as if he were guilty of everything. What unfolded on that roadside wasn't just about power or authority. It was about something far darker, something that cuts deep into the soul of society. And the truth waiting to be revealed will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. It was a morning like countless others in his life, yet one that would eventually mark the beginning of something unforgettable. John Daniels rose early, as he always did, with the faint glow of dawn peeking through the blinds of his modest home. To most people in his neighborhood, John was the quiet, disciplined man who never seemed rushed, never appeared unprepared. But beneath that calm exterior was a man who had worked tirelessly for years to earn not only his position but also the respect that came with it. John wasn't just another face in the city. He was a man who carried weight, authority, and responsibility few could imagine. As the newly appointed head of internal affairs, his role was to ensure accountability within the police department itself, a job both admired and resented. He lived his life knowing that truth was often uncomfortable, and that those who fought for it rarely walked an easy road. Yet despite the pressure of his position, John valued his private moments, a strong cup of coffee in the morning, a short jog before work, weekend dinners with his sister and her kids. To him, these rituals were the anchors that kept his life balanced. In his community, John was known simply as Mr. Daniels, the man who volunteered at youth programs and mentored teenagers who needed guidance. He had grown up here, in these very streets, and knew what it meant to feel overlooked or underestimated. That was why he gave back, because he remembered being that kid, searching for someone who believed in him. On this particular evening, John had wrapped up a long day of reviewing misconduct reports at headquarters. It was a draining task, reading accounts of abuses, inconsistencies, and systemic failures. He took the work seriously because he knew every file represented a person whose life had been disrupted, sometimes shattered. By the time he left his office, the city had already started to quiet down. Streetlights glowed against the pavement, and traffic had thinned to a slow trickle. John eased into his car, enjoying the familiar hum of the engine. To anyone watching, he looked like a man heading home after a regular day at work, and in many ways he was. But there was something heavier in his thoughts that night. He had just signed off on an investigation that could implicate several officers in a scandal, one that, if exposed, would shake public trust even further. He knew enemies were forming in the shadows, people who wouldn't be pleased with the way he was peeling back layers of corruption. Still, John wasn't a man who let fear dictate his choices. He believed that accountability, no matter how uncomfortable, was the cornerstone of justice. And while his title gave him authority, it was his personal conviction that truly drove him forward. That conviction had been shaped by his own life experiences, the sting of being profiled in his youth, the lectures from mentors who reminded him to rise above, and the unshakable belief that change, though slow, was worth fighting for. As he drove through the quiet streets, he thought briefly of his late father, who had once told him, "Son, the world will test you in ways you'll never expect. But the real test is whether you'll stand firm when it matters most." Those words lingered in his mind that night. The hum of the engine, the rhythm of the tires on asphalt. Everything seemed calm, almost too calm. Yet calm has a way of being deceptive. Because in the rearview mirror, John soon noticed a pair of headlights approaching, closer, then closer still. They didn't pass him. They followed. John didn't panic. He had been in situations before where officers tailed him, suspicious of nothing more than the color of his skin or the kind of car he drove. He told himself it was routine, maybe nothing. Still, his grip on the steering wheel tightened ever so slightly. The neighborhood around him looked the same as it always did, but John couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was different. A subtle unease began to build, the kind that creeps in slowly before it becomes undeniable. He turned down a familiar street, hoping to brush off the tension, but the car behind him turned too. Its headlights remained steady, unblinking, like eyes fixed on a target. What John didn't know then was that this night, this ordinary drive home, would soon spiral into something far more sinister. A confrontation that would not only test his patience and dignity, but also expose about power, prejudice, and justice that could not be ignored. The calm was fading, the night was changing, and John Daniels, a man who had dedicated his life to holding others accountable, was about to find himself on the other side of the badge. The cruiser's headlights clung to John's car like a shadow determined to follow wherever he went. He told himself to stay calm, keep steady, and not let frustration take hold. Encounters like this weren't new to him. The difference was that this time, the wrong officer had chosen the wrong man, but John didn't think of that yet. At that moment, he was simply another black man being followed, forced to weigh every choice with invisible consequences. The siren cracked the silence, sharp and commanding. Red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror, painting his face in bursts of color. John slowed the car, signaling properly, and pulled over to the curb with measured precision. His heart didn't race, he had trained himself to stay composed. But beneath his calm exterior, a quiet storm brewed. The officer approached slowly, flashlight cutting through the darkness, its beam slicing across John's car. To any passerby, it might have looked like a routine traffic stop. To John, it was the beginning of something else entirely. He rolled down his window, resting his hands visibly on the steering wheel. The way every black parent teaches their children to do, an instinct not for convenience, but for survival. The officer's voice came harsh, clipped, and cold, demanding identification, questioning his presence in the neighborhood. His words weren't casual inquiries, they were accusations wrapped in the thin veil of procedure. John, dressed in a tailored suit from his long day at work, was treated as though he were a trespasser in his own city. He complied, as he always did, but the tension grew with each passing second. The officer circled his car, shining the flashlight deliberately, searching for something, anything that could justify the stop. John knew the look. He had seen it in countless complaints filed against officers, suspicion first, reason later. Minutes stretched longer, heavy with silence. The officer's tone sharpened as he pressed John for answers that needed none. Where was he coming from? Why was he here? Did he own this vehicle? John responded calmly, without hostility, but his patience thinned as the questions piled. Then came the moment that shifted the air. The officer told John to step out of the car. His voice carried the weight of authority, but also something darker, an intent to control, to diminish. John hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of defiance, but out of disbelief. He had done nothing to warrant escalation. Yet here it was, escalating anyway. He opened the door slowly, stepping into the cool night air. The pavement felt colder beneath his shoes, the kind of chill that seeps into the bones when the world suddenly feels hostile. The officer stood taller now, emboldened by the power of the badge, mistaking silence for submission. A second cruiser pulled up. Two more officers emerged, their presence heavy, their eyes sharp with unspoken judgment. John stood there, surrounded, as though he were a threat that needed containment. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was the very person tasked with investigating abuses like this, now standing in the center of one. One officer began searching the car without permission, rifling through the glove compartment and back seat. John kept his voice steady as he reminded them of his rights, but his words were brushed aside, dismissed as though they carried no weight. The message was clear. In their eyes, he was not a man of authority, not a citizen with rights. He was a suspect. The humiliation cut deeper than the fear. John knew the statistics, the patterns, the numbers that told a story society often tried to ignore. But numbers couldn't capture the sting of being treated as less than human. They couldn't capture the way a grown man felt when his dignity was chipped away, piece by piece, under the glow of police lights. Every second felt like a test. How long could he stay calm? How much could he endure without snapping? Because he knew that even the smallest sign of frustration, a raised voice, a sudden movement, could be twisted into justification. He had seen the reports. He had read the statements. He had signed off on investigations where the victim never made it home. The officers whispered among themselves, voices low but laced with judgment. their laughter carried in fragments, mocking, dismissive. To them, this was just another stop, another man to intimidate, another display of power. To John, it was a mirror of every complaint he had ever read, now made personal, visceral, and undeniable. And yet, through it all, he kept his composure. Because John knew something they didn't. This wasn't just a stop. This wasn't just intimidation. It was a moment destined to unravel in ways they couldn't foresee. The officer barked another order, telling John to keep his hands where they could see them. He obeyed, steady and controlled, but inside he carried a fire that burned hotter with each insult, each glance of suspicion. He thought of the young men in his community, the ones he mentored, who looked to him for guidance. He thought of the advice he always gave them: stay calm, stay alive. Your dignity is worth more than their hatred. But in that moment, John questioned it. Was dignity something that could truly survive in the face of humiliation like this? The search turned up nothing. No drugs, no weapons, no evidence of any crime. Still, the officers lingered, unwilling to let go, unwilling to admit the truth staring them in the face, that the stop had been built on nothing but prejudice. The night dragged on, each second adding weight to the injustice. John remained standing, silent but unbroken, his presence alone challenging their assumptions. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that this wasn't just another man on the roadside. This was the head of internal affairs, the man with the power to turn their actions into consequences. But John didn't reveal it, not yet. Timing mattered. And when the truth came out, it would not be whispered. It would be undeniable. For now, he endured. The tension grew, the stakes climbed higher, and the night edged closer to the breaking point. Because rising action always leads to one thing: the climax. And for John Daniels, that moment was approaching fast. The cold night air thickened around John as he stood by the side of the road, framed by flashing lights. Time felt suspended, stretched taut like a wire ready to snap. 3 officers surrounded him now, their body language rigid and their eyes darting with suspicion. To them, John was not a man with a life, a career, or a family. He was just another target. The lead officer stepped closer, his jaw set with arrogance. He towered over John, using his posture like a weapon. His voice dripped with authority sharpened by contempt. You think you're clever? That suit doesn't fool me. Guys like you don't belong here. John inhaled deeply, steadying himself. His silence wasn't weakness, it was restraint. He knew every word, every flicker of defiance could be twisted. The officer smirked, mistaking calm for submission, and shoved him lightly against the hood of the car. Not hard enough to leave a mark, but enough to send a message: you are beneath me. The humiliation struck deeper than the shove itself. John thought of his father, his mentors, and the countless people who had endured moments like this and swallowed their pride just to survive. But he also thought of the young men he guided, the ones who looked to him for strength. If he allowed himself to break here, what example would he set for them? Another officer chimed in, accusing John of hiding something. They threatened to impound his car, to run his name through every database they had. John knew the game. They were looking for leverage, for any shred of justification. But they would find nothing. His record was clean, his life lived with integrity. Still, innocence meant little under the weight of prejudice. As the minutes dragged on, the tension escalated. The officers' frustration grew. Every second they came up empty made them more determined to bend the narrative in their favor. John felt the pressure, the thin line between control and chaos. He could sense the climax approaching, though he didn't yet know what form it would take. Then, without warning, the lead officer reached for his cuffs. "Turn around," he barked. The order cut through the night like a blade. John froze, not out of fear, but out of disbelief. Arrest? On what grounds? His chest tightened with indignation. For a brief, dangerous moment, his composure wavered. Should he resist? Should he demand an explanation? His mind raced with the consequences. One wrong move, and this could spiral into tragedy. But John was no ordinary man standing on that roadside. He was the head of internal affairs, and the moment had come to remind them of it. He straightened his back, his voice finally breaking the silence with calm authority. "Before you put your hands on me," he said slowly, You might want to check who you're dealing with." The officers exchanged glances, irritation flickering into confusion. The lead officer scoffed, dismissive. "Save it. Everybody's somebody when they're in handcuffs." John reached into his jacket pocket, deliberate, controlled, every movement exaggerated to avoid giving them an excuse. He pulled out his identification badge and held it up to the flashing lights. The silver emblem glinted sharply, undeniable in its authority. "I'm John Daniels," he said firmly, "head of internal affairs. And every second of what you've done tonight is already burned into memory mine, and soon yours." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. The officers froze, their arrogance evaporating in an instant. The badge, the name, the position, it all crashed into them like a tidal wave. What they thought was just another stop had transformed into a career-altering mistake. The lead officer's face drained of color. His bravado faltered, words stumbling out in fragments. We were just following procedure." "Procedure?" John cut in, his tone icy. "Was it procedure to follow me without cause? To search my vehicle without consent? To treat me as though my existence was reason enough for suspicion? Tell me, officer, whose procedure are you following?" The younger officers shifted uneasily, their confidence shattered. One tried to interject, but his voice cracked, betraying the fear creeping in. They all knew what internal affairs meant. Investigations, reports, accountability, the very force they had mocked and abused now held their future in its hands. John didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His authority came not from volume, but from truth. "Every complaint I've read, every file I've reviewed, it has led to this moment. And tonight you've proven every single one of them right." The officers stood paralyzed, their silence an admission of guilt louder than any words. The flashing lights, once symbols of power, now felt like beacons exposing their shame. John lowered the badge slowly, but his eyes never left theirs. "I gave you every chance to see me as a man first," he said quietly, "but you chose not to. And now you'll answer for it." The weight of his words hung in the air. The power dynamic had shifted completely, the hunters revealed as the hunted. The officers who once loomed with authority now shrank under the gravity of their own actions. But the climax was not just about their downfall, it was about what it represented. In that moment, John embodied every voice silenced, every dignity stripped, every injustice brushed aside. His reveal wasn't just personal vindication, it was symbolic justice. The lead officer finally spoke, his voice trembling. We made a mistake." John's expression hardened. "A mistake is forgetting paperwork. A mistake is taking a wrong turn. This," he gestured to the scene around them, the flashing lights, the humiliation, the baseless accusations. "This is not a mistake. This is a choice." Silence followed, thicker than before. The kind of silence that comes when truth is undeniable and excuses crumble to dust. John knew the climax had reached its peak. The officers, stripped of arrogance, stood exposed. The night that began with humiliation had turned into revelation. And yet, John also knew this wasn't the end. The true impact of tonight would come later, when the reports were filed, when the investigations began, when the consequences fell. But here, in this moment, the balance had shifted. The man they tried to break had not only endured, he had revealed himself as the very force that could break them. The climax was complete. The resolution, however, was still to come. The flashing lights finally dimmed, but the weight of what had happened lingered in the night air. The officers, once puffed up with arrogance, now stood in silence, stiff, uneasy, their bravado stripped away by a single badge and the truth it carried. John Daniels remained calm, though his chest ached with the tension he had endured. He knew this wasn't just about him. It was about every man and woman who had stood in his place, voiceless, powerless, and humiliated. For several moments, no one spoke. The night was still, as though the city itself was listening. Then John tucked his badge back into his jacket and stepped closer to the officers, his gaze unflinching. "You wanted to make me small tonight," he said quietly. "But understand this. Every report I've read, every complaint I've filed, has a face, a name, a story. You've just become part of that story. And this time, the ending won't be yours to write. The lead officer swallowed hard, his earlier arrogance gone, replaced with something resembling shame or at least fear of consequence. He muttered an apology, but the words fell flat, hollow, like a band-aid over a wound too deep to hide. John didn't respond. Instead, he walked back to his car, opened the door, and sat in silence for a moment. His hands rested on the steering wheel, steady but heavy, as he let the reality of the night sink in. He had faced humiliation, danger, and injustice, and yet he had turned it into accountability. But even as he drove away, John knew the story was far from over. Tomorrow there would be paperwork, reports, and formal investigations. The officers' careers would hang in the balance, and the department would once again face the uncomfortable truth it so often tried to bury. And beyond the walls of the precinct, this story would ripple outward, into living rooms where families discussed justice, into classrooms where young people questioned authority, into communities where trust was fragile yet hope still flickered. Because what happened to John wasn't unique. It was a reflection of something larger, a system where suspicion too often replaced fairness, where power too often overshadowed humanity. And though his position gave him the ability to fight back, he knew many others weren't so fortunate. That was the real takeaway. This wasn't just one man's story, it was the story of countless others who never had the chance to reveal a badge, to shift the balance, to demand respect. Their stories ended differently. Too often they ended in silence. As John pulled into his driveway, the first rays of dawn hinted at the horizon. A new day was beginning, one filled with paperwork, phone calls, and consequences. But it was also a day filled with something more, resolve. He stepped out of his car, the chill of the night fading as the promise of sunlight grew stronger. He thought of his father's words again. The real test is whether you'll stand firm when it matters most. Tonight he had stood firm. But more importantly, he had stood not just for himself, but for everyone whose dignity had been stripped by prejudice. Before walking inside, John paused, looking back at his car one last time. The reflection of the night's ordeal still clung to it, but he let out a breath, steady and sure. The fight wasn't over, but neither was his resolve. And so, he carried the weight of the night with him, not as a burden, but as fuel. Because this was more than just his story. It was a mirror. And the question that remained was simple, yet haunting. How many more mirrors will it take before society finally sees the truth?